When German forces crossed into Poland on September 1, 1939, they unleashed a new form of warfare that would shock the world. The rapid coordination of armored divisions, mechanized infantry, and tactical air support created the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, that seemed to rewrite the rules of military engagement. Within weeks, Poland had fallen. The following spring, Denmark and Norway succumbed in days and weeks, respectively. Then came the stunning 6-week campaign that brought France to its knees, forcing the British Expeditionary Force into a desperate evacuation at Dunkirk. To observers worldwide, the Wehrmacht appeared to be an unstoppable juggernaut, a perfectly orchestrated military machine that had solved the riddle of modern warfare. This perception, however, was a dangerous illusion, one that even Germany's own leadership came to believe. The truth beneath the surface of these spectacular victories revealed fundamental structural weaknesses that would eventually doom the Third Reich's war effort. The Blitzkrieg's success depended on specific conditions that could not be replicated indefinitely. Short distances, well-developed infrastructure, and above all, campaigns that concluded before logistics became the determining factor. Germany had created a military designed for swift, decisive campaigns, not for the grinding attrition of total war that lay ahead. The German economy in 1939 was not prepared for sustained total war. Despite years of rearmament under Nazi rule, Germany had not fully mobilized its industrial capacity or rationalized its production systems. The German civilian economy continued to function at near peacetime levels during the early war years. Consumer goods remained widely available, and civilian consumption stayed relatively high compared to what Britain and later the Soviet Union would implement. This was partly deliberate policy. Hitler, remembering the home front collapse of 1918, feared that excessive hardship would undermine public support for the war. The Nazi leadership wanted both guns and butter, a fundamentally unsustainable position for a nation engaged in total war. The structure of German armaments production compounded these problems. Unlike the streamlined systems that would later emerge in Allied nations, German war production operated through a chaotic network of competing agencies and authorities. The Wehrmacht, the SS, the Air Ministry, and various economic ministries all had their own procurement systems and priorities. Personal fiefdoms and bureaucratic rivalries led to duplication of effort, inefficient allocation of resources, and production of weapons that were often over-engineered and difficult to manufacture in quantity. A German tank might be superior in quality to its Soviet counterpart, but if Germany could produce 3 tanks in the time it took the Soviets to produce 10, the tactical advantage became a strategic liability. This lack of rationalized production extended throughout the military supply chain. The German military used hundreds of different vehicle types, each requiring unique spare parts and maintenance procedures. This diversity created nightmares for supply officers trying to keep units operational. A repair depot might have parts for one model of truck, but not another, rendering vehicles useless not because they were destroyed, but because they couldn't be maintained. The obsession with technical perfection and the proliferation of variants meant that German logistics operated under enormous strain even during the victorious campaigns of 1939 to 1941. The early Blitzkrieg campaigns succeeded in part because they were fought close to Germany's hard industrial heartland with relatively short supply lines. The invasion of Poland required supplying forces across distances measured in hundreds of kilometers, not thousands. Captured Polish railways and road networks, though damaged, could be quickly put to use. More importantly, the campaign lasted only weeks before organized Polish resistance collapsed. The Wehrmacht could fight on its initial supplies and captured stockpiles without truly testing its logistical endurance. The French campaign followed a similar pattern. The distance from the German border to Paris is roughly the same as from Berlin to the Polish capital. The road and rail infrastructure of Western Europe was the most developed in the world. French roads were excellent, railways extensive and well-maintained, and the terrain favorable for mechanized movement. The campaign's rapid conclusion meant that German forces could often fight using captured French fuel and supplies. The appearance of logistical mastery was really logistical luck, geography and speed making up for systematic deficiencies that remained hidden. These early victories also relied heavily on captured enemy equipment and resources. The fall of France delivered enormous quantities of military equipment to German hands. Thousands of trucks, millions of rifles, vast stores of ammunition and supplies, and most critically, fuel stocks fell into Wehrmacht possession. These captured resources actually sustained German military operations for years afterward. French trucks would later be seen on the roads of Russia, serving in a campaign their manufacturers never imagined. This dependence on captured equipment revealed a disturbing truth. Germany could not sustain its military through its own production and resources alone. The German railway system, the backbone of any major military logistics operation, was designed for Central European conditions. German rail infrastructure was excellent within the Reich's borders and in Western Europe, where rail gauges were standardized. But this system was built for a European war of the 19th or early 20th century model, where front lines might shift by hundreds of kilometers, not thousands. The railways could supply forces fighting in France or Poland adequately, but they were never designed to support armies operating deep in Russia or North Africa. The Wehrmacht went to war with a logistics infrastructure suited for regional conflict, not global total war. The Luftwaffe's role in early German victories concealed another logistical vulnerability. German air power proved decisive in Poland and France, providing close air support and interdicting enemy movements. But the Luftwaffe was primarily a tactical air force designed to support ground operations rather than conduct strategic bombing or long-range missions. Its aircraft had relatively short ranges and required well-developed airfield infrastructure. As campaigns moved farther from Germany's borders, maintaining air support became increasingly difficult. Airfields had to be constructed or captured, fuel and ammunition transported over lengthening supply lines, and maintenance performed under field conditions. The apparently invincible Luftwaffe was actually built for short campaigns in good weather over developed terrain. When Germany turned its attention eastward in June 1941, all these hidden weaknesses suddenly became critical vulnerabilities. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German and Axis troops advanced on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had previously attempted. The distances were vast beyond German experience. From the border to Moscow was over 1,000 kilometers, to the Caucasus oil fields more than twice that. The infrastructure was primitive by Western European standards, with few paved roads and railways built to a different gauge than German rolling stock. The logistical challenges appeared immediately. German planners estimated they could supply forces up to a certain distance from railheads using truck transport. Beyond that point, either the railways had to be converted to German gauge or supplies had to be transferred to captured Soviet rolling stock. Both processes proved far slower than anticipated. German railway troops worked frantically to convert Soviet rail lines, but they could not keep pace with the advance. The gap between the forward elements of the Wehrmacht and the railheads supplying them grew wider with each passing week. The Wehrmacht advanced with stunning speed in the first months of Barbarossa, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. But with each kilometer eastward, the logistics situation deteriorated. Trucks broke down on primitive Russian roads, and spare parts were scarce. Fuel consumption exceeded estimates as vehicles struggled through mud and sand. The hundreds of different vehicle types in German service made maintenance nearly impossible under field conditions. Horses, which still comprised the bulk of German army transport, died in huge numbers from exhaustion and lack of fodder. By August 1941, barely 2 months into the campaign, German forces were experiencing critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, and basic supplies, despite being nominally victorious on every battlefield. The approach of winter found the Wehrmacht still deep inside Soviet territory, farther from its supply bases than any German army had operated before. The logistical system was stretched to the breaking point. Units sat immobile for lack of fuel. Artillery rationed shells. The winter clothing that had been promised never arrived in sufficient quantities because the railways couldn't carry it forward. Soldiers froze in summer uniforms because the logistics system had collapsed under the strain of distance and the primitive infrastructure. The failure to capture Moscow in December 1941 was not primarily a failure of tactics or strategy, but a failure of logistics. The German army had advanced beyond the reach of its supply system. The illusion of Blitzkrieg invincibility was finally shattered in the snows outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht had proven it could win battles and conduct brilliant operational maneuvers, but it could not solve the fundamental problem of modern warfare: how to supply million-man armies fighting thousands of kilometers from home across hostile territory with primitive infrastructure. The easy victories of 1939-1940 had taught the wrong lessons. Germany had built a military for short, victorious wars close to home. Now it was locked in a total war of attrition against enemies with deeper resources, and the logistical chickens were coming to roost. Part 2. The Breaking Point, 1942 to 1943. The winter of 1941-1942 marked a fundamental shift in the character of the war. The Wehrmacht had survived the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow, but barely. German forces held their positions through sheer determination and Hitler's insistence on no retreat. But the logistical crisis that had contributed to the failure to capture Moscow persisted into the new year. Supply lines remained overstretched, equipment losses mounted without adequate replacement, and the German military faced for the first time the prospect of a prolonged multi-front war for which it was fundamentally unprepared. By 1942, Germany was fighting major campaigns simultaneously in North Africa, occupying much of Western Europe, preparing for renewed offensives in the Soviet Union, and defending against increasing Allied bombing raids over the Reich itself. Each of these theaters demanded resources, supplies, and logistical support. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, already strained to the breaking point in Russia, now had to support operations across the entire European continent and into North Africa. The mathematics of total war were inexorably turning against Germany, though this reality would not become fully apparent until the catastrophes of late 1942 and early 1943. The North African campaign exemplified the growing mismatch between German strategic ambitions and logistical capabilities. Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was sent to Libya in early 1941 to shore up the failing Italian forces, but what began as a limited commitment evolved into a major theater of operations. North Africa offered minimal strategic value to Germany. There was no oil there for the German war machine, no industries to capture, no resources that Germany desperately needed. Yet Hitler allowed the commitment to grow, pouring troops and supplies into a theater that was a logistical nightmare. Every item needed by the Africa Corps had to cross the Mediterranean Sea, which was increasingly dominated by British naval and air power operating from Malta and Alexandria. Convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and reinforcements ran a gauntlet of submarines, surface ships, and aircraft. Losses were staggering. Ships that did make it to North African ports then faced another challenge, moving supplies forward to forces operating hundreds of kilometers into the desert. The Africa Corps fought its entire campaign at the end of a supply line that was under constant attack and frequently severed. Rommel became famous for his tactical brilliance and aggressive maneuver warfare, but his operations were constrained at every turn by logistics. The Desert Fox might plan a bold offensive, but its execution depended entirely on whether fuel convoys made it across the Mediterranean. Tank battles in North Africa were often decided not by tactical skill, but which side could keep its vehicles fueled and supplied. Rommel's forces advanced when supplies were available and retreated when they ran out, creating a pattern of advance and withdrawal that characterized the North African campaign. The Africa Corps never had the logistical support necessary to achieve decisive victory, yet Germany continued pouring resources into this theater until the final collapse in Tunisia in May 1943. The Mediterranean supply crisis illustrated a broader problem with German logistics. The Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe could not protect supply lines against determined Allied interdiction. Germany had entered the war without adequate naval forces for a global conflict, and by 1942, the situation had worsened considerably. The Luftwaffe, designed primarily as a tactical air force supporting ground operations, lacked the long-range bombers and naval aircraft necessary to suppress Allied naval power effectively. Convoys to North Africa sailed with minimal protection, relying on Italian naval escorts that were increasingly outmatched by British forces. Germany's inability to secure its maritime supply lines was a critical strategic failure that would only become more pronounced as the war continued. In the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht prepared for its 1942 summer offensive with renewed optimism. The goals were ambitious: drive south to capture the Caucasus oil fields, cutting off Soviet fuel supplies while securing petroleum resources for Germany's fuel-starved military. The offensive, code-named Case Blue, began in late June and initially achieved impressive gains. German and Axis forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, destroying Soviet formations and capturing vast territories. But the advance was repeating the pattern of 1941, moving faster than the logistic system could sustain. The German offensive split into two main thrusts, one driving toward the oil fields at Baku, the other toward the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. This division of forces created two separate logistics challenges, each requiring its own supply network across the vast southern Soviet steppes. The infrastructure in this region was even more primitive than what German forces had encountered in 1941. Railways were sparse. Roads were unpaved tracks that turned to impassable mud with rain, and the distances from German supply bases grew with each week of advance. By August 1942, German spearheads were over 1,500 kilometers from their starting positions, supplied by rail lines that had to be converted from Soviet to German gauge, then by trucks traveling on roads that existed more in theory than practice. Fuel shortages began to limit operations almost immediately. Panzer divisions sat idle waiting for fuel deliveries. Aircraft were grounded at forward airfields because aviation fuel couldn't reach them in sufficient quantities. The Wehrmacht was repeating the mistakes of 1941 on an even larger scale, advancing into territory that its logistics system could not effectively support. The battle for Stalingrad became the focal point of the 1942 campaign and the symbol of Germany's logistical failure. Hitler's obsession with capturing the city named after Stalin led to a grinding urban battle that consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, equipment, and supplies. The German Sixth Army and supporting forces required hundreds of tons of supplies daily just to sustain their positions in and around the city. These supplies had to travel across lengthening supply lines that were increasingly vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks. The logistics situation deteriorated throughout the autumn as Soviet forces prepared their encirclement operation. When Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, they cut through the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks and encircled the entire Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers across. The Wehrmacht faced an immediate crisis: how to supply an entire army by air while it fought to break the encirclement. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, rashly promised Hitler that the Air Force could supply the pocket, claiming that aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the encircled forces. This promise was logistically impossible, and anyone with understanding of air transport capabilities should have known it. The Luftwaffe had never conducted an airlift operation on this scale. The transport aircraft available were inadequate in number and capability for the task. Airfields inside the pocket were under constant Soviet artillery fire and air attack. Weather conditions in the Russian winter were appalling, with snow, ice, and fog frequently grounding aircraft. The entire concept of supplying an army of this size by air was fundamentally flawed, but German leadership, detached from logistical reality, believed it could be done. The airlift failed catastrophically. On good days, German transport aircraft might deliver 100 to 150 tons of supplies to the pocket, less than a third of the promised amount and far below the minimum necessary to sustain the trapped forces. Aircraft were shot down by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Planes crashed in bad weather or were destroyed on the ground. The few supplies that did arrive were often the wrong items, equipment and ammunition that didn't match what the troops needed. Soldiers inside the pocket slowly starved and froze, while transport aircraft burned irreplaceable aviation fuel attempting to sustain the unsustainable. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 was the most visible symbol of German logistical failure, but it was part of a broader pattern of overextension and collapse. The Wehrmacht had attempted to conduct major offensives across vast distances without the logistical infrastructure to support them. The failure was not primarily tactical or even strategic in the conventional sense. It was a failure of logistics, of basic arithmetic about tons of supplies needed versus tons that could be delivered. Simultaneous with the Stalingrad disaster, the situation in North Africa was reaching its own breaking point. The British victory at El Alamein in November 1942 sent Ramos' forces into retreat. The Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria trapped the Axis forces between two Allied armies. Germany responded by pouring reinforcements into Tunisia, trying to hold a bridgehead in North Africa. Over the next 6 months, Germany transported over 100,000 fresh troops to Tunisia, along with tanks, artillery, and supplies. These forces required constant resupply across Mediterranean shipping routes that were under even heavier attack than before. Ships leaving Italian ports had less than even chance of reaching North Africa. The Axis dumped enormous resources into Tunisia for no strategic gain, simply delaying the inevitable while bleeding resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany itself added another dimension to the logistics crisis. British Bomber Command and the growing American Air Forces were conducting increasingly heavy raids on German cities and industrial targets. While the effectiveness of strategic bombing remains debated, one clear impact was on the German transportation network. Marshalling yards, railway junctions, bridges, and industrial facilities came under regular attack. Repairs required resources and labor that might otherwise have gone to supporting military operations. Air defenses consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, and the fighter forces defending Germany needed fuel, spare parts, and replacement aircraft. The air campaign forced Germany to divert resources from the front lines to homeland defense, further straining an already overstretched logistics system. By early 1943, the breaking point had arrived. Germany had lost an entire army at Stalingrad. North Africa was collapsing. The logistics system was straining to support operations across multiple theaters while under constant air attack. Industrial production, while increasing under Albert Speer's rationalization efforts, could not compensate for the distribution problems created by damaged infrastructure and overextended supply lines. The Wehrmacht had fought to the limits of its logistical endurance and beyond. The myth of German military invincibility lay shattered in the ruins of Stalingrad and the deserts of North Africa. The illusion of Blitzkrieg success had given way to the reality of total war, and Germany was losing the logistics competition that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The question now was not whether Germany could win, but how long it could sustain the fight against enemies with vastly superior resources and increasingly effective logistics systems of their own. Part 3. The Resource Crisis and Failed Adaptations, 1943 to 1944. The catastrophes of early 1943 forced German leadership to confront an unpleasant reality. The Reich lacked the fundamental resources necessary to sustain total war against the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire. No amount of tactical brilliance, organizational reform, or ideological fervor could compensate for the basic arithmetic of resource availability. Germany was fighting a war of attrition with insufficient oil, inadequate raw materials, and a shrinking resource base that diminished with each territorial loss. The period from 1943 to 1944 witnessed increasingly desperate attempts to adapt to these constraints, but adaptation could not overcome the fundamental mismatch between Germany's ambitions and its means. The oil crisis stood at the center of Germany's resource problems. modern mechanized warfare consumed petroleum products at staggering rates. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ships, and the entire infrastructure of military logistics required fuel. Germany had entered the war with limited domestic oil production and dependence on imports and synthetic fuel production. The synthetic fuel program, one of the great technological achievements of the Nazi period, used coal gasification and liquefaction to produce gasoline and diesel. But synthetic fuel plants were expensive, complex, vulnerable to bombing, and could never produce enough to meet the Wehrmacht's needs. By 1943, fuel shortages affected every aspect of German military operations. Training for the Luftwaffe pilots was drastically reduced because aviation fuel was too precious to waste on instruction. New pilots arrived at combat units with minimal flight time, facing Allied aviators who had hundreds of hours of training. The result was predictable. German pilots died in large numbers, their technical skill insufficient to compensate for inadequate preparation. The Luftwaffe's decline from air superiority to irrelevance was partly a story of logistics, of fuel shortages that made proper training impossible. Ground forces faced similar constraints. Panzer divisions, the elite of the Wehrmacht, increasingly operated as static defensive formations because they lacked fuel for mobile operations. The very concept of Blitzkrieg, the rapid maneuver warfare that had brought Germany its early victories, became impossible when tanks couldn't move. Divisions ordered to new sectors might take weeks to arrive, conserving fuel by moving short distances each day. The mechanized army that had conquered France in 6 weeks was being reduced to immobility by fuel scarcity. German forces in 1944 often fought more like the armies of 1918 than the mobile formations of 1940, not by choice, but by necessity. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet and submarine force both suffered from fuel shortages. U-boats, which had nearly brought Britain to its knees in 1942, increasingly remained in port because there wasn't enough fuel for extended patrols. When they did sail, submarines had to conserve fuel, limiting their operational effectiveness. The surface fleet, already largely confined to port after earlier losses, became essentially a fleet in being, its major units unable to sortie because fuel was needed elsewhere. Germany's naval strategy was crippled by an inability to fuel its ships. Romania's Ploiești oil fields were crucial to Germany's fuel supply, providing a significant portion of the Reich's petroleum. The loss of access to these fields would be catastrophic, yet they were vulnerable to air attack. In August 1943, American bombers launched a massive raid on Ploiești, causing significant damage, though at heavy cost to the attackers. The raid demonstrated that Germany's oil supply was not secure. Follow-up attacks in 1944 systematically destroyed the Ploiești refineries, cutting off Germany's main source of natural petroleum. The Wehrmacht's fuel crisis, already severe, became catastrophic. Beyond oil, Germany faced shortages of virtually every strategic resource. Natural rubber was unavailable, forcing reliance on synthetic rubber that was inferior and insufficient. Strategic minerals like tungsten, chromium, and manganese, essential for high-quality steel production, were in short supply. Copper for electrical wiring, lead for batteries, aluminum for aircraft, all were rationed and increasingly scarce. German industry performed miracles of substitution, using inferior materials and developing alternatives, but substitutes were rarely as good as the real thing. The quality of German equipment began to decline as manufacturers were forced to use substandard materials. The loss of Allied and occupied territories accelerated the resource crisis. Each territorial retreat meant losing access to resources, industries, and labor. The Soviet advance westward in 1943 and 1944 cost Germany access to Ukrainian grain, coal, and iron ore. The loss of Italy as an ally in September 1943 was both a strategic and resource disaster. Italy's industrial capacity, though modest compared to Germany's, had contributed to the Axis war effort. More critically, Italy's surrender opened a new front that Germany had to defend, draining resources from other theaters. The Italian campaign exemplified the growing irrationality of German strategic decisions driven by resource constraints. After Italy's surrender, Germany occupied the country and fought a grinding defensive campaign up the Italian peninsula. The mountainous terrain favored defense, but it also required enormous amounts of ammunition, equipment, and supplies to sustain forces there. Every ton of supplies sent to Italy was a ton not available for the eastern or western fronts. Germany was defending territory that offered little strategic value while consuming resources it could not afford to spare. Yet withdrawal would have freed Allied forces for use elsewhere, so Germany remained locked in a campaign that steadily bled its logistics system. The Eastern Front continued to dominate German logistics planning and consume the bulk of available resources. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht had recovered sufficiently to launch one more major offensive, Operation Citadel, against the Kursk salient in July 1943. The offensive was Germany's last chance to regain the initiative in the east, and enormous resources were concentrated for the attack. New Tiger and Panther tanks, the best armor Germany produced, were rushed to the front. Ammunition stockpiles were built up. The Luftwaffe concentrated its remaining strength. The offensive represented a massive logistical effort, the Wehrmacht gathering its strength for one final blow. Citadel failed. Soviet defenses were too strong, their preparations too thorough. German forces advanced into carefully prepared defensive zones and were ground down in attritional battles that Germany could not afford. The offensive consumed vast quantities of ammunition, destroyed or damaged hundreds of irreplaceable tanks, and exhausted German reserves. When Soviet forces launched their own counteroffensives, the Wehrmacht lacked the resources to contain them. The initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviets. Germany would fight defensive battles for the remainder of the war, each retreat shortening its supply lines, but also reducing access to resources and increasing the pressure on an already strained logistics system. The Atlantic Wall represented another enormous investment of resources for questionable return. Hitler ordered the construction of massive fortifications along the European coast to defend against the anticipated Allied invasion. Millions of tons of concrete and steel went into bunkers, gun emplacements, and obstacles. The labor and materials consumed by these fortifications might have been used to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The Atlantic Wall absorbed resources that could have strengthened mobile reserves, which ultimately proved more valuable than static defenses. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the elaborate fortifications were overcome in hours, while German mobile reserves lacked the fuel and transport to counterattack effectively. The Allied landing in Normandy exposed the full extent of Germany's logistics collapse. German forces in France had been stripped to reinforce other fronts, particularly the east. The divisions that remained often lacked adequate transport, fuel, and equipment. When the invasion came, German commanders found themselves unable to concentrate their forces for a decisive counterattack. Panzer divisions ordered to Normandy took days to move to Normandy, forced to move at night to avoid Allied air attack, and constantly short of fuel. Units arrived piecemeal and were committed to battle in fragments rather than as coordinated formations. Allied air superiority made German logistics almost impossible in daylight. Transport columns had to hide during the day and move at night. Railways were under constant attack, with bridges, tunnels, and marshalling yards systematically destroyed. Supplies piled up behind the front because they couldn't be moved forward. The German army in Normandy fought under conditions of severe material disadvantage, not because supplies didn't exist, but because the logistics system couldn't deliver them. Ammunition was rationed, fuel was scarce, and replacement equipment rarely arrived. The wealthy industrial economy of Germany might as well have been on another planet for all the good it did troops fighting in Normandy. Albert Speer's rationalization of German industry achieved impressive results in increasing production. Tank and aircraft output reached their highest levels in 1944, demonstrating that Germany's industrial capacity, properly organized, could still produce enormous quantities of weapons. But production without distribution was useless. Tanks sat in factories because there were no trains to move them. Aircraft remained grounded at manufacturing facilities because pilots and fuel weren't available. Ammunition was stockpiled in Germany, while troops at the front ran short. The German logistics system had become so disrupted that it could no longer effectively distribute the products of German industry to the forces that needed them. The systematic destruction of Germany's transportation network by Allied bombing reached its peak in 1944. American strategic bombers, escorted by long-range fighters that could now reach any target in the Reich, conducted precision attacks on oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation nodes. British bombers continued their nighttime area bombing campaign, destroying cities and disrupting industrial production. The combined bomber offensive, which had been of questionable effectiveness in earlier years, was now achieving its goals. German oil production plummeted. The railway system operated at a fraction of its pre-war capacity. Industrial production began to decline as factories couldn't receive raw materials or ship finished products. By late 1944, Germany caught in a vicious cycle. Fuel shortages limited military operations and training. The weakened Luftwaffe couldn't protect transportation networks from air attack. Damaged transportation infrastructure made it impossible to distribute supplies effectively. The inability to supply forces properly led to military defeats and territorial losses. Each territorial loss reduced access to resources, worsening shortages. The Wehrmacht was being strangled by logistics failure, unable to leverage what industrial capacity remained because the means to sustain military operations had collapsed. Germany's war effort was entering its final phase, sustained more by inertia and the determination of individual soldiers than by any coherent logistics system capable of supporting modern warfare. Part 4. Total Collapse, 1944 to 1945. The final year of the war witnessed the complete disintegration of German military logistics. What had begun as strain and shortage evolved into total systemic failure. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer a modern mechanized force, but rather a collection of increasingly isolated units fighting with whatever resources they could scavenge locally. The sophisticated logistics apparatus that had supported the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941 had been reduced to ruins, destroyed by years of attrition, Allied bombing, territorial losses, and the inexorable mathematics of resource depletion. Germany entered 1945 not merely losing the war, but fundamentally incapable of waging modern warfare. The transportation network, the circulatory system of any military logistics operation, had been systematically destroyed. Allied bombers had spent years attacking railways, and by late 1944, their efforts were bearing catastrophic fruit for Germany. Major rail junctions existed only as ruins. Bridges across rivers had been dropped into the water. Marshalling yards were moonscapes of craters. Locomotives and rolling stock had been destroyed in numbers that exceeded Germany's capacity to replace them. Even undamaged sections of track were often unusable because they connected nothing to nothing, isolated segments in a network that no longer functioned as a coherent system. The German railway system in 1944 operated at perhaps a quarter of its 1939 capacity, possibly less. Trains that did run moved at crawl speeds, stopping frequently to repair tracks damaged by bombing or sabotage. A journey that had taken hours in peacetime now required days or was impossible altogether. The railways could no longer support sustained military operations or distribute the products of German industry to the forces that needed them. Supplies accumulated in some areas, while troops elsewhere went without basic necessities. The Wehrmacht had become logistically incoherent, unable to move resources from where they existed to where they were needed. Road transport fared little better. The truck fleet that had carried supplies to forward units in earlier campaigns was largely destroyed or immobilized. Vehicles had worn out from years of hard use on poor roads. Spare parts were unavailable. Most critically, there was no fuel to run the trucks that did exist. German logistics increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport, a regression to 19th-century methods that was hopelessly inadequate for modern warfare. Horses could not move the tons of ammunition that mechanized divisions consumed in battle. They could not transport replacement tanks or heavy equipment. The German army of 1945 was supplied like the army of 1915, trying to fight an enemy equipped with the full industrial capacity of the mid-20th century. The fuel crisis reached its terminal phase in the last months of 1944. The systematic bombing of synthetic fuel plants and the loss of Ploesti had reduced German fuel production to a fraction of minimum requirements. Every liter of gasoline or diesel was precious beyond measure. The Luftwaffe, which had once darkened the skies over Europe, was grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Thousands of aircraft sat at airfields, serviceable but unable to fly. Pilots, already inadequately trained due to earlier fuel rationing, now received essentially no flight time. The few missions that were flown consumed fuel that might have kept tanks moving or allowed essential transport operations. The panzer divisions, once the terror of European battlefields, became immobile fortifications. Tanks remained in defensive positions not from tactical choice, but because there was no fuel to move them. When Allied forces broke through German lines, panzer divisions that might have counterattacked in earlier years could only watch helplessly as enemy forces exploited the breakthrough. The concept of armored warfare, of rapid maneuver and concentrated striking power, had become impossible. German tanks in the final year of the war were essentially expensive pillboxes used as static gun emplacements because mobile operations were beyond German capabilities. Against this backdrop of logistical disintegration, Hitler ordered one final offensive in the West. The Ardennes Offensive, launched in December 1944 and known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's last major attack of the war. The offensive was ambitious in scope, aiming to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and potentially force a negotiated peace in the West. The Wehrmacht assembled powerful forces for the attack, scraping together its last operational reserves and concentrating them in the Ardennes forest sector. The Ardennes offensive was premised on a logistical fantasy. German planners knew they lacked sufficient fuel to reach Antwerp. Their solution was to capture Allied fuel depots during the advance, using enemy supplies to sustain their own offensive. This was not logistics planning, but rather logistics gambling, betting the operation's success on capturing supplies whose location and accessibility were uncertain. The plan revealed the desperation of Germany's situation. A military force that must rely on capturing enemy supplies to sustain its operations has already lost the logistics war. The offensive began on December 16, 1944, with German forces achieving tactical surprise and initial success. American units, caught off guard, fell back under the assault. But the logistics fantasy quickly unraveled. German spearheads advanced rapidly in the first days, but their supply lines could not keep pace. The roads through the Ardennes were inadequate for the traffic trying to use them. Traffic jams developed that stretched for kilometers. Supply trucks bringing forward ammunition and fuel were stuck in massive gridlock, while the tanks they were meant to supply ran dry at the front. The fuel situation became critical within days. German armored columns began running out of fuel well short of their objectives. Some units captured small quantities of American fuel, but nothing like the amounts needed to sustain the offensive. By the third day of the attack, German tanks were being abandoned on Belgian roads, out of fuel and going nowhere. The mighty offensive, Germany's last gamble in the West, was literally running on empty. The Luftwaffe made a maximum effort to support the ground offensive, but could sustain operations for only a few days before fuel exhaustion grounded the aircraft once again. The Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserves to no purpose. The attack gained ground initially, but never came close to reaching Antwerp or achieving any strategic objective. By early January 1945, American and British forces had contained and then crushed the offensive, destroying much of the force Germany had committed. The Wehrmacht had expended its final mobile reserves, lost thousands of irreplaceable tanks and vehicles, consumed fuel stocks that could never be replaced, and gained nothing. The offensive was a logistics disaster that hastened Germany's final collapse. As 1945 began, the German military situation was hopeless. Soviet forces were advancing across Poland toward Germany itself. In the West, Allied armies stood poised to cross the Rhine and invade the Reich. Italy was lost. The Luftwaffe existed as a paper force, with aircraft but no fuel, pilots but no training, and an industrial base under constant bombardment. The Kriegsmarine's surviving ships remained in port, useful only as floating artillery batteries. The Wehrmacht divisions defending Germany were divisions in name only, often understrength by half or more, lacking transport, short of ammunition, and surviving on captured supplies and local requisitioning. The German logistics system, such as it remained, operated on improvisation and desperation. Units fought with whatever weapons they had, often a hodgepodge of German, captured, and obsolete equipment. Ammunition was rationed to a few shells per gun per day. Food supplies were erratic, with frontline troops sometimes going hungry, while supplies rotted in warehouses that couldn't be reached due to destroyed transportation. The Wehrmacht had become a hollow force, divisions marked on maps but barely capable of sustained combat due to lack of supplies. German industry continued producing weapons into early 1945, a testament to Speer's organizational abilities and the dedication of German workers. Tanks rolled off assembly lines, rifles were manufactured, artillery pieces were completed. But these weapons might as well have remained as raw materials for all the good they did. There was no fuel to move tanks from factories to the front, no locomotives to transport artillery, no ammunition to feed the rifles. German industry was producing for an army that no longer existed as a functional military force. The disconnect between production and distribution was total. The Rhine crossings in March 1945 demonstrated the completeness of German logistics collapse. Allied forces crossed the river against opposition that would have been fierce in earlier years, but was now fragmented and weak. German forces lacked the fuel to move reserves to threatened sectors. They had insufficient ammunition for sustained defensive fire. Communication systems had broken down, leaving commanders unable to coordinate their forces effectively. The great river barrier of the Rhine, which might have been held for months with adequate supplies, was breached in weeks because the forces defending it lacked the material means to fight effectively. In the east, the situation was even more catastrophic. Soviet forces advancing into Germany encountered desperate resistance from units that fought with fanatical determination but almost no logistics support. German soldiers defended their homeland with whatever weapons remained, but courage could not substitute for ammunition, food, or fuel. The Wehrmacht dissolved as a coherent fighting force, fragmenting into isolated pockets that fought on until they were destroyed or captured. The Eastern Front had become a running battle of extermination, where logistics barely mattered because there was nothing left to supply. The final battles in Berlin epitomized the total logistics collapse. German forces defending the capital scrounged ammunition from depots, armed civilians with whatever weapons could be found, and fought with the determination of those who had nothing left to lose. But determination without supplies is merely prolonged dying. Artillery fired until ammunition ran out, then fell silent. Tanks fought until their last shell, then became obstacles. The defenders of Berlin were supplied, if at all, by what they could carry or what remained in local stockpiles. The elaborate logistics network that had once sustained millions of troops across an entire continent had been reduced to soldiers filling their pockets with ammunition and hoping it lasted until they died. The German surrender in May 1945 was not merely a military defeat, but the acknowledgement of complete logistics exhaustion. Germany had not simply lost battles or territory, it had lost the capacity to wage war. The Wehrmacht could not move, could not shoot, could not sustain operations even at the tactical level. The sophisticated military machine that had conquered most of Europe in 2 years had been destroyed not primarily by superior Allied tactics or strategy, though these played their part, but by the inexorable logic of logistics and resources.